So I'm Hailey Lipkin, and I'm going to discuss prospective alternatives to chemical mosquito control for Manitoba. Now, mosquito control. This is quite the topic for Manitobans and is heatedly discussed in every neighborhood every summer. It is also a very broad subject, so I'm going to try and use my allotted 12 minutes wisely and briefly outline the current situation in Manitoba and highlight some interesting and new alternatives, including my master's thesis research. But if you have any questions or want me to elaborate on anything, please come up to me at the end of the lectures, and I will be happy to have a more in-depth conversation with you. So first, I'll give you a bit of a background about myself in the field. I was in a master's program 2 years ago at London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and studied the control of disease vectors. So basically, insects that transmit diseases in tropical countries with a focus on developing countries. Mosquito behaviors vary significantly across species. So in the control world, this means that what works for one doesn't necessarily work for another. The same goes for the environmental conditions. So the new methods that I'm going to discuss have been successfully trialed in certain countries and with the specific mosquitoes that prevail in that climate. So all of these methods are very viable ideas for Manitoba, but would first need to be trialed under Manitoba environmental conditions and with Manitoba mosquitoes before we can say for certain whether they will work in practice. Since today is all about sustainability for Manitoba, I have to make one more clarification before I begin. Regarding mosquito control, there isn't anything that is 100% sustainable, because whenever humans intervene and try to kill a population of something, it's going to impact the balance of the ecosystem in some way. So these methods are relatively sustainable compared to chemical control and are simply alternatives with less of an environmental and ecological impact, environmentally sensitive, if you will. So let's begin. Our problem. Mosquitoes. So there's two reasons mosquitoes are the problem. And there's two reasons why people control mosquitoes. One, they're a nuisance, they're pests, and two, because they transmit diseases. So in Manitoba, we're fortunate that we've only really experienced a West Nile virus threat. However, as many speakers have spoken about today, climate change is real. And this brings different species of mosquitoes to new areas and with new pathogens. As Manitobans, we would be naive to think that this cannot affect us. So mosquito control is very important, and we need to be proactive. Mosquitoes are the deadliest creatures on the planet, and Manitoba has been described as the mosquito capital of the world. So obviously, we need to be proactive, and we need to think about these things. Just as an example, in 2008, there was a species of mosquito that's never been found in Manitoba that was trapped, Culiceta melanura, and it transmits eastern equine encephalitis, and it kills approximately 35% of the people that are infected with it. Now, this is all theoretical, but the species was trapped here, and it's likely due to climate change. So these are things that we need to think about, and we need to be preventative. So I'm going to outline the current control in Manitoba, and highlight a couple of the interesting ones. And so basically, Manitoba has been using malathion since 1977 as a chemical adulticide. So it attacks the adult stage of the mosquito. And actually, Manitoba has really been doing an excellent job of trying to accommodate with the needs of our community in using more natural methods. So in 2005, they started using BTI, which is a biological tool, and so it's a bacteria, it's naturally derived, and it's environmentally sensitive. So they started using that to attack the immature stages, the larvae in the water. So given that, malathion is really the issue here. It's a debate every summer. So I'm going to talk about the pros and cons. Now, as much as environmentalists don't necessarily like to admit it or think about it all the time, it's really effective. And so that's a big plus when you're trying to control something. But it also has a lot of cons, given that it's a chemical. It has adverse health effects. There's been studies that have linked ADHD to malathion exposure in children. Also, people have have complained about asthma issues Manitobans have, and that they've had to leave the city of Winnipeg whenever there's been annual sprays. So that's a big issue. It has a huge environmental and ecological impact. As you can see in that chart over there, that's a study that was actually conducted in the US, but I kind of picked apart some local Manitoba fish species that were found to have high levels of malathion toxicity in them. And so that's really something to think about. Resistance is a huge issue whenever you're using chemicals because, as it's been said today before, chemicals, they really have one or two modes of action. And so it's so easy to develop resistance to only one or two modes, whereas more natural compounds, they're very complex, so they have multiple modes of action. And so it's harder to develop resistance, or it slows the development of resistance because there's so many modes that a species would have to have a resistant gene towards. Social divide, really, I think that's a big issue with malathion because people argue about it all the time. It's not good for community feelings, so that's a huge issue that we really need to cover. So non-chemical alternatives are the solutions, and there should have been some life cycles up on the screen, so I'll describe them instead. So basically, the idea with any type of control is that you have to think about the behaviors of what you're trying to control. So you pretty much have to exploit the mosquito's behavior, the mosquito's life cycle and life stages. And so there's a land stage for the mosquito life cycle, it's the adult, and then there's a water stage, which are the immature stages, the larva and the pupa. And so implementing larva control in the water and implementing land control for adults combined together, it attacks it in every different stage, which Manitoba is already doing with the BTI in the water and the malathion control on land. And then there's also behaviors that you can exploit. And so there's host-seeking behaviors, mating behaviors, and so you can really get them at that too. And so based on the fact that Manitoba is already using an excellent larvicide, Manitoba needs new adulticides because those are harder to get. How do you feed a mosquito a bacteria? You put it in the water so you can give it to the larva, but a mosquito that's flying around, it's really hard to implement that besides spraying a chemical everywhere. A professor of mine used to always say, regarding control, you have to think like your beast. And so with mosquitoes, you really do. You have to think, where are they going to host seek? Where are they going to lay their eggs? And how can we exploit these behaviors? So the first tool I'm going to talk about is the ProVector BT. This is what I did my research on for my master's thesis, and it uses BTI, but for the first time, they're actually able to give it to adults because of this funny-looking flower device, and it serves many purposes. So both males and females, they sugar feed, and so the flower has sugar-feeding stimuli to attract the mosquito towards it, and then there's a BTI disc that's behind that mesh, and the mosquito feeds through the mesh on the BTI, and in my study it was shown to be very successful. I tested it against Anopheles mosquitoes in Tanzania, and they transmit malaria. So in that community, in those environmental conditions and with those species, it was very successful. So the pros about them is that it was effective. The best thing about this tool is that it's so specific, and so it only targets targeted species like mosquitoes. So, and especially the ProVector BT, the mesh is only small enough for a mosquito's proboscis to fit in, and so it actually doesn't harm any other insect. And so that's great. It has a less ecological impact. It doesn't touch anything in the environment, even though BTI, according to the WHO, is fairly safe to put in water. It's still, you don't even have to use that mode, so it's just so contained, which I think is just excellent. And also, because the BTI, it's a biological control, it has less resistance, lower resistance development. BTI has toxins in it that can only bind to specific receptors on certain insects' midgut. And so basically, if you don't have the receptor, it's not going to affect you. And so that's why it's specific and and that's why it's really excellent. So another tool is fungus. And so fungus has been trialed for larvae control as well as adult control. And given that we're going to talk about adult, it's really interesting. It basically, it's effective. It's biological, multiple modes of action, and they're coining it resistance proof. I mean, that's quite the grand statement, but so far it seems like it is. And the reason behind it is because its longevity. It takes a really long time for it to actually take an effect, and so it's great for disease control. But they're calling it resistance proof because a resistance gene has a cost. It has a fitness cost associated with it, and so it decreases the amount of eggs, in this particular case, decreases the amount of eggs that a mosquito can lay, and that's the most important thing for a species, is to reproduce. And so it's not beneficial. It's not as beneficial to confer a resistance gene because the fitness cost that would be associated with not being able to pass on its genetics, and so it's not as pressure to select for those resistance genes because it wants to be fit, it wants to lay eggs. And so the fungus takes about 10 to 14 days to get into effect and to kill the mosquito. And so it's not entirely suitable for nuisance control because they're still able to lay eggs, but it's great for disease control because a pathogen inside of an insect has a certain amount of time that it needs to take to develop in order to be transmitted. And so it can take upwards of 10 days for it to be transmitted. So if a mosquito had a West Nile virus, then the mosquito would likely die before it was able to transmit it. So it's great for disease control regarding adults and not so good for nuisance control. There's other life effects that it has. It decreases its need to feed, and so it's not only mortality that it affects, and like I said, it decreases the fecundity, so the amount of eggs that they lay. The final technique is sterile insect technique, which I find interesting. It's basically they release sterile males into the population and they sterilize them via radiation techniques or genetic modification. And so when these males are released, they mate with females, and then the females lay eggs that aren't viable. And so it stops it at the next generation. The pros are it's effective. It's non-material, so you're not actually putting anything out there. There's no chemical, there's no biological control. You're releasing male mosquitoes that don't bite, that don't transmit disease, and it's extremely specific because it's only to that specific species of insect that you're releasing. The cons are that it's labor intensive, so it's not necessarily very viable in developing countries per se, but in countries that can afford it, it is. Now I'm going to conclude by saying integrated vector management is really the goal, and Manitoba is already doing it. They're using multiple tools to all combine together and affect the mosquito population. So especially for natural methods of control, which maybe doesn't have as high of efficacies as the chemicals, it's really important to integrate them together. So you can catch them at all different stages. If a different tool doesn't, the other tool will maybe catch them. And now what you can do is get involved. We can wish as much as we want that the province will stop using malathion, but really every single person can get involved. And so there you can reduce the water on your lawn. There's BTI that you can buy at a store that you can put if you have water pots that you wanted to keep. If you have a pool, make sure you have a hard cover. And really it's just a breeding source reduction. And that's what everyone can do, and that every single part helps in the whole process. Thank you.